Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for this open house organized by the Partnership for Economic Inclusion. I am Loli Arribas-Baños, and I am the practice manager for the Social Protection and Jobs practice at the World Bank, where the Partnership for Economic Inclusion sits. Today is the first open house after the summer break, and what might be considered our third season of events. Between now and December, we will have an exciting offering of topics, and these include a session on extreme poverty and economic inclusion, another session on economic inclusion pathways towards green, resilient, and inclusive recovery, a topic which I believe is increasingly relevant in the context of the compounding COVID, climate, and price shocks crisis, and a third one on coaching in economic inclusion programming, which will have a special focus on addressing negative gender social norms. So stay tuned for announcements and invitations on these events. We will post them on the Partnership for Economic Inclusion Twitter account. So please follow us there if you aren't already. The topic of today's event is making markets more inclusive. And the objective is to share experiences on how economic inclusion programs address constraints for extreme poor producers to access markets. And the ultimate purpose is helping households, poor households, smooth consumption and income, and develop insurance mechanisms and protect key assets. As I said before, in the context of the current and more frequent economic and climate shocks, these economic inclusion programs have become even more important. They help build resilience and strengthen the ability of poor households to manage risks and to avoid negative coping mechanisms such as skipping meals, selling assets, etc. Today, we will have the opportunity to learn about programs from Ethiopia, Uganda, and Zambia, which are part of a global trend of economic inclusion programs that are increasingly using a mix of market integration strategies, such as the use of cooperatives and producer networks, the use and strengthening of more inclusive value chains and natural resource management, and collaboration between public and private stakeholders that are active at the local levels. This event is inspired by one of the in-practice publications by the Partnership for Economic Inclusion, which is titled Creating Market Links to Increase the Impact of Livelihood Programs for Extremely Poor Women in Zambia, which I've been told we just published. So you should be able to read it anytime now. But before we start the event, some housekeeping rules. There is simultaneous interpretation into Arabic, French, Portuguese, Spanish, and English. Please click on the glove icon at the bottom of your screen to change the language to your preferred channel. We are hoping to have an engaging and interactive session, so please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat box, and please use the chat box also to ask any questions to the speakers throughout the session. A few words on the format of the event. We will begin with a framing presentation by Boban Barges-Paul, who is the co-author of the publication I just mentioned, and who will share some lessons and findings from the report. We will then hear the experiences from the Government of Zambia, and those will be followed by some insights from the NGOs, Village Enterprise, and Mercy Corps. And then we will have some final reflections from our discussion from USAID. We will end with a Q&A session with all of our panelists, so please keep sending your comments, insights, and questions in the chat box. So without further ado, let me pass the virtual mic to Boban, who is a senior social protection specialist at the World Bank, Over to you, Boban, and I'm told that you have 9 minutes for your presentation and that I have to remind you when the time is up. Over to you.
Sounds good, and thank you so much, and good morning and good afternoon to everybody who's joined, and good evening. I'll kick in, I'll just straight jump into the presentation because I have 12 slides in 9 minutes, so I need to quickly go through these, but we can come back to questions as well. I'll start with some framing slides and then kind of go into what are some of the findings we have from the work that we did in Zambia, and then kind of some final reflections. In terms of framing, right? I mean, we're kind of trying to define what are these market linkages, and we don't want to kind of make it seem like it's something that is completely new, right? Because economic inclusion programs already do some of that in terms of kind of facilitating extreme poor households to link to markets. So if you look at market linkages, basically these are concerted efforts to enhance these links to the broader economy around them. So pictorially speaking, just to make the concept a little clearer, if you were to think about extreme poor households at the middle there, economic inclusion programs are already kind of pushing them to engage with markets in the local community and regional markets. And market linkages basically kind of expand that even further and kind of make that they do that in a more concerted way. The other way to kind of look at it is in terms of the constraints that market linkages try to release, right? And from the State of Economic Inclusion report, we have these, you would have seen this, these are all the constraints that a lot of the extreme poor households face across the world in becoming more productive. Economic inclusion programs typically, right? It's not to say everywhere, but typically tend to engage and try to release some of the individual and household level constraints, so human capital, physical capital, or social capital constraints, and then to some extent also kind of work on the community level constraints around gender norms or social norms or exposure to risks. Market linkages, on the other hand, kind of try and engage much more closely with the local economy, in terms of inputs and outputs and labor, and I'll talk about that a little more as well in the next slide. So what do market linkages look like from the perspective of a household, right? So for a household, these interventions basically help them engage more closely with markets, right? So they either provide interventions that would help them have new or more product lines. So if they are working in coffee, they can also kind of look into something that's a bit more adjacent to that in terms of products. Increase the value addition from the operation in that particular commodity. So like processing of coffee and stuff, which can also increase their returns. And then linkages to value chain actors, right? So kind of having more kind of, creation of producer groups, linkages upstream as well as downstream through the value chain for a particular commodity. And then there is another, it could also be through referrals to existing services or programs that kind of indirectly also, have the objective of improving their linkages to markets. So this could be in the form of agricultural extension or trainings as well. And we focused a lot more on the linkages to value chain actors in this part of the work that we did. And the last point here would be, the source of the financing for these linkages, right? To kind of facilitate these linkages could start off with public or private, right? I mean, maybe the government is investing in that, or maybe there's private sector financing coming in. But eventually, if you want to kind of move towards, letting the markets take over these interventions, then eventually, the aim is that private sector finance will take over and public sector finance will reduce over time. But it may differ across contexts as well. Why are they important? As Lolly just explained, it enhances welfare impacts, improves long-term sustainability. There is improved cost effectiveness when the private sector comes in and the business equation kind of comes in, and enhances its inclusion and social cohesion, especially in areas where inequality levels are extremely high. The context in which we did this, right? We did this practice review basically in an attempt to try and explore how do you link beneficiaries of the Supporting Women's Livelihood Project component of Jewel Project and the Zambia Agribusiness and Trade Project? So essentially, they kind of, can, some of the beneficiaries that ZATP was working with could potentially buy from the SWL beneficiaries, their inputs, or just the final commodities as well. But eventually, maybe even SWL beneficiaries could kind of upgrade to become ZATP beneficiaries over time. And you will hear more about this in as the next presenter comes on as well. In terms of the scope, so we took on, we kind of relied heavily on whatever programmatic information was available publicly, and then held, a few additional primary interviews to fill the gaps, and used a snowballing approach basically to kind of get a sense of which programs could be interviewed, which programs had, some semblance of these kind of linkages that we were trying to establish between the extreme poor and extreme poor households and the markets. So we reviewed 21 projects operating in 15 countries, a majority of which were sub-Saharan African countries, and most of basically 18 of those were implemented by NGOs. And from these reviewed projects, I mean, there are we basically identified 3 mechanisms to facilitate market access, and I will talk about each of these as we go in the next few slides. So to start with, facilitating commercial partnerships with buyers. So a project could be working with a group of farmers, helping them to organize their production, and then in addition to that, working with buyers. So kind of doing a scan of the region to figure out who could be buyers from these producer organizations, and then working with them to even kind of establish these contracts, right, in a way that is equitable, but is fair as well to both sides of the partnership. The buyers themselves, as well as the project, may also kind of think about ways in which they can bring in other input suppliers or service providers, and there's a reason for that, and I'll talk about that as well as we go. There are one of the primary challenges of kind of making these partnerships work is building trust, right? Because you need to be able to trust that the buyer will take whatever they've committed to take as produce, and that the producer organizations will produce the production, the quantity as well as the quantity and the quality of production that they have kind of signed into. While these are challenges, I think some organizations have also found interesting ways to kind of overcome them. One is, just giving price premiums, right? So as long as the quality and the quantity agreements are met, the buyers could give a slight price premium so that the producer organizations have an incentive to meet those targets, but also not to side sell and kind of, feel like they can make better, get a better return from selling it outside of the partnership. Some organizations also had like a graduated incentive-based contract system, which basically rewarded the adherence to these agreements and to the partnership. So if you met the agreement in 1 year, you would be in tier 1, and then as you meet the agreement again in the next year, you kind of graduate upwards to tier 2, which then means that you have access to higher prices, but also embedded services. So that's another way in which some of the organizations have tried to make it attractive for the producer organizations to continue in these partnerships by embedding some of these services like inputs as well as credit. And I think you will also hear this from the experience in Zambia that Barnabas will be speaking about after this. The second method that some of these projects have taken on is by basically helping producer organizations to identify a sales agent who would basically be the face of their producer organization, would be doing a lot of the work in terms of identifying, doing the scanning of the region, identifying the buyers, kind of negotiating the contracts, making sure that these contracts are being met, but also kind of working with input suppliers and service providers, in the market to help the producer organizations meet the targets. Here again, trust is essential. This is actually kind of overarching theme that we will talk about as well, that, it's important that there is trust in these partnerships, between the sales agent as well as and the production producer organization, but also the buyer and the producer organization, which we spoke about before this. In terms of building trust with the sales agent, I mean, often many of these producer organizations basically select a sales agent from amongst them. There's one person who may be more qualified, who may have slightly more experience than others to play this role, which though, given that they sometimes come from contexts where there hasn't been much exposure to markets and much exposure to this kind of work, which may also mean that, the sales agents may not have the right skills to do this kind of engagement, forward on the value chain. And this is where the project can come in, basically by doing, more trainings and also doing, hand-holding, especially at the early stages, so that the sales agents can basically, start, learn by doing, and then become better at their job, and basically then become more sustainable over time. The third is basically where a project, doesn't necessarily work across the value chain as much, but, understands one or two aspects, like, basically identifies one or two aspects where they may want to invest more. And these could be, the binding constraints in the market, right? For example, if you identify that, well, it's easy, there are producer groups already in place, but then they don't have sufficient input suppliers, or they don't have sufficient number of sales agents, in which case then, the project may decide that they will start investing in those, so subsidizing the creation of more input markets or the creation of more sales agents. But that may not necessarily, the project need not necessarily ensure that the sales agent goes and works with producer organization A or B, and, kind of doesn't necessarily look at the way these contracts are set up and stuff. But then that has a, but they do kind of think of it in terms of a value chain, however, because you need to kind of think across the value chain, from the farm to table, for example, right? Kind of thinking in that kind of the whole holistic thinking around that, the value chain. Now, the difficulties to kind of doing this is to identify that aspect itself, right? And this is where market and needs assessments in regions can be pretty useful in identifying these binding constraints where the project can come in and support. But in addition to that, you may also kind of realize that, while you have input suppliers, that doesn't necessarily mean that these producer organizations are able to go there and access them as well. So you may kind of, the project may decide that they do this, but then in addition to that, they also kind of do some more concerted effort across the value chain. So kind of a hybrid approach between, 1, 2, and 3 that we identify here. Now, just in terms of some key steps.
Boban, if you can start wrapping up, please.
Yes,
please go through the key insights. But
sounds good. Sounds good. So, I think we've kind of outlined some steps to basically, think about market linkages and making that work, right? One is an assessment, and this is kind of the challenge that we're kind of trying to resolve is knowledge, because it starts with there, right? If you don't know who are these smallholder farmers, or if you don't know what the regional market looks like, it's difficult to know where these value chain linkages can work. Second is agglomeration, because a lot of the farmers that especially economic inclusion programs work with are extremely small scale micro entrepreneurs. They may not have the kind of production capacity to meet the needs that value chain linkages require. So agglomerating across them. Third is building trust, as I said, is an important component. Fourth, thinking about physical and commodity proximity, right? I mean, if you identify a value chain opportunity in tomatoes, but the farmers that we work with work on potatoes, and it's kind of a difficult challenge for them to jump from that to suddenly start, growing tomatoes just because there's a value chain opportunity there. So thinking about that. But importantly, thinking about value addition opportunities, right? It's the value addition that ensures that there are these synergistic relationships and that they can be held, that can be kind of maintained over time. Facilitating embedding of additional services, as I said, and then diversifying upstream and downstream linkages. This is mostly to ensure that you reduce the monopsony or the monopoly tendencies, because, if a producer organization has a contract with just one buyer, and that buyer for some reason is not able to purchase their produce, that agreement or that partnership basically ends, right? But again, to the extent possible, it's useful to kind of diversify that. And then operationalizing private sector partnerships, which is important because eventually you want the private sector to take on. And this could be, partly through open tender procurement, but it also could be, informal networking where you have farm markets set up with producers, and then you have some buyers coming in there to meet these producers and kind of figuring out if they can work together. So in conclusion, I think economic inclusion programs already are engaging or capacitating households to engage better with markets, but more concerted effort could enhance these linkages, right? It is important to think about challenges and opportunities of value addition, and I will kind of stress on that value addition part to think about how much more can you create from that one partnership, right? And then, it's important to also start taking stock of urban value chains, mechanisms to link poor and vulnerable urban households to private sector and regional and national markets. And then lastly, the policy and institutional context. I mean, we don't talk about it a lot in the study itself, but it is very, very important for these linkages to actually work and for private sector to participate in these value chain linkages. With that, I conclude, and back to you, Lolly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Boban. Just a very quick question to you before we move to the next presentation. You've talked about the need to build trust. You've talked about the importance of proximity and the important role of the private sector. Can you elaborate briefly on how you can do this in countries where the informal sector is predominant, including, as part of potential buyers, and how this might impact the links to the value chain? And before passing the mic to you, I see that there's quite a few people asking for the presentation. We will be sending all the presentations at the end, and you can also find them in the PEI, the Partnership for Economic Inclusion site. I also see that some people are raising their hands. Please enter your questions or your comments in the chat, and we will make sure that we channel them to the presenters. So Boban, just very quickly, if you can reflect on countries in which the informal sector is predominant. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Lolly. Great question, and I don't have any straight answers here, but I'll give it a shot. I think, I mean, even in informal, when you kind of think about an informal setting, it's important to define the perimeter of a market that you're trying to look into, right? If you're kind of thinking about informal producers in, let's say, in an urban area in a locality A, and if you think of a buyer in a locality which is very far away and who doesn't know anything about the locality A, it becomes a little tougher to kind of make that link, right? So it's important to start small, but to also start closer to home from these producer organizations, assuming the markets are even working in those areas, right? Because in some places, maybe that also doesn't exist. I mean, I'm in Angola, and I've seen in many rural areas here, it isn't easy to find a market. But, what we've seen is some economic inclusion programs can still create some of these markets over time. So kind of thinking in, within the closer proximity of where they are based, that's how we thought about it in Zambia, and then kind of thinking a bit longer term, right? It doesn't need, building trust takes time, right? It doesn't happen in a few months. It may happen over a year or 2 years, but it's important that whatever is kind of contractually agreed to is simple enough for both parties to understand and kind of can be met, right? So that the commitments are not too high, so that, either of the parties don't kind of meet those agreements. So I think, with that and kind of staggering the commitments and kind of staggeringly increasing those, it is possible to, over time, right, build these kind of market linkages. But yeah, it takes a lot of effort, and it takes a lot of kind of minute thinking about the details to get there.
Okay. Thank you, Boban. Let me suggest that we proceed with the next presentation from Barnabas Musonda, who is the manager of the program supporting women's livelihood from the Ministry of Community Development and Social Services at the Government of Zambia. His presentation will also touch upon food security, an issue that is on everyone's minds these days. So Barnabas, you have 9 minutes. I'll try to be a little bit more conscious of being a timekeeper now. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and greetings to everyone. I'm glad to be invited to this very important platform. As you have already indicated, I'm working under the Ministry of Community Development and Social Services on the Supporting Women Livelihood Project, which is a component of JUEL under the Department of Community Development. And I'll just go straight into the objective of the partnership that we are trying to establish with ZATIP, the one that Boban has already alluded to. I must mention, first of all, that this is a new initiative in the project, and what we are trying to do currently is just to pilot in 2 districts of Zambia, which is Betaoke and Pongwe. Briefly about the packages that the project offers. From the inception in 2015 of the project, we have been giving 4 facilities, I mean, excuse me, to the beneficiaries. First of all, when the beneficiaries are identified, they are taken through the 3-week training in life and business skills, and now we have added the component of health, reproductive health, just to solicit for support from the spouses of the beneficiaries. And after the training, the beneficiaries are given productive grants of equator equivalent of $250. And then we also facilitate the formation of 7 groups. And we also recruit the volunteers, the ones that we call community-based volunteers from the communities where we identify these beneficiaries to provide the mentorship to the beneficiaries. I should point out that the beneficiaries that we are targeting are drawn from extremely poor households, and now from the social cash transfer households after the adoption of the cash plus model. The key deliverables currently, we are in 26 rural districts in Zambia. The project is targeting to reach out to 81 districts out of the 116 that we have in Zambia, with the current funding that we have supported by World Bank. And so far, we have trained the women in the trainings that I mentioned earlier, 90%, and 96% of the targeted women have so far received the productivity grant. We also have women, but 79% of women who are our beneficiaries have started participating in the service groups activities. Next slide, please. So the partnership with ZATIP, as I mentioned earlier on, is a new initiative in the project. And this was after the realization that most of our beneficiaries actually, they are engaged in agricultural production as a business. Also, this partnership, we are hoping that it is going to improve the capacity to finance and execute productivity, enhancing investments, and also respond to the requirements of the contestable end markets and major buyers. Through this partnership, also we expect the beneficiaries from the projects to be linked to productive alliances to increase access to markets for emerging farmers on the project. What is the rationale there for this value chain linkages with ZATIP? The first one is that this linkage initiative there is a need for our beneficiaries to start accessing the high value varieties of seeds in order to improve food security and nutrition at household level. The other rationale is that we have to link our beneficiaries to the already existing structures in the ZATI projects, where they already have the platform where they are bringing together the buyers and as well as the producers of the crops at a community level. Next slide, please. The picture is just showing some of the cooperatives that we visited in the 2 districts where we are doing the pilot. This is Mwanjamantu village in Petauke village. And what we are seeing behind is a structure that was built with support from the ZATI project. This structure, the main purpose is for the cooperatives to store their inputs once they are delivered to their community, as well as stocking their produce before the buyers come to pick them. The other picture is actually showing how the crops are sorted and aggregated before the buyers come to buy from the cooperatives. What is interesting with this linkage is that the partnership that we are establishing, the interactions that we've had so far with the cooperatives is that most of our beneficiaries are already part of the cooperatives. And in areas where they are not, there was a strong indication from the cooperatives that they are willing to take on our beneficiaries to become part of their cooperatives. In areas where the cooperatives are not existing, we are encouraging the beneficiaries through their savings groups to register as cooperatives so that they can access the subsidized inputs from government through the Ministry of Agriculture, and also can market their use to food reserve agents, which is also a government institution. Next slide. Okay, the challenges are not different from what Boban alluded to. We have the first one is high cost of farming inputs. This is a very big challenge because most of our farmers are drawn from extremely poor households, and the inputs therefore from the markets have proven to be very expensive for the farmers, and hence this linkage that through the cooperatives, the farmers can be able to access the subsidized inputs either from Ministry of Agriculture through the cooperatives, or the department also has an intervention, social protection intervention, where it gives out the inputs to vulnerable but viable farmers, where we have already engaged the department to see how best our beneficiaries can also be considered for this facility in the next farming season. And the other challenge is limited access to extension services. I wish to indicate here that in Zambia, the extension services are mostly offered by the Ministry of Agriculture, but the staffing levels, especially at community level, they are quite low. And in most communities, they don't even exist. So this has a huge impact on the agricultural production, especially for small-scale farmers, where our beneficiaries fall under. And the other challenge is also poor yields. This is mainly because of high cost of inputs, especially the seeds. The farmers, they resort to use the recycled seeds, which give them low yields, and also they are characterized by low germination rates and lack of uniformity. The other challenge that we have noticed is lack of funding. Lack of financial resources to facilitate the scaling up of S2E1 initiative to the remaining 35 districts. And also, we during the period that we've implemented, there is a group of people that have been left out in the selection criteria, such as the youth, the women in urban areas have been left out. And it is also, as a project, we are hoping that if the funding can be improved so that we reach out to the remaining 35 districts and also include the other cadre of people that have been left out in the initial programming. The recommendations therefore are that there is need for adequate market with stable prices for farmers. Usually the markets for grains are provided by the FRA, the Food Reserve Agency, and also the private sector. But the price that is offered for, especially by the private sector, is quite low. And FRA also, they have the depots. And in some communities, the distances from the communities to the depots are quite far, and the farmers have found it to be very costly to deliver their produce to the market. Also, the other recommendations is what I've already alluded to, is the access to quality and affordable inputs. I just mentioned that we are looking at ways of linking our farmers to the government subsidized inputs, which are given through the Ministry of Agriculture, and also our own food security program under the department. The other one is to strengthen the extension services. We are in discussion with the Ministry of Education to see how best the areas where our farmers are existing, how the extension services can be extended to those areas in order to help the farmers improve their productivity.
Barnabas, if you can start wrapping up, please.
Yes, please. The next slide. So in conclusion, I just wanted to indicate that the SWL component, if properly managed, can improve access and change the livelihoods of the women that are targeted, and also that the linkages that we are trying to establish with our colleagues who are already are going to help us sustain the gains that we've already achieved through this intervention of supporting that women livelihood. I thank you, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. There are a few questions already in the chat, and hopefully we will have time to address those in the questions and answers. There were quite a few questions about the incentives for private sectors to work with such micro producers, and I guess a related one, how to strengthen the bargaining power for the producers. I think Barnabas and Boban had touched a little bit on that when they talked about cooperatives and that, how those cooperatives can increase the bargaining power for producers, and also perhaps increase the scale and the incentives for private sector to work with them. But Barnabas, if you could reflect very quickly on a topic that will be the focus of the future open house, which is whether or not these programs, or this one in particular, has contributed positively to change the gender social norms and the agency of women, or negatively. Sometimes men and societies react negatively to increase women agency and economic empowerment. So can you reflect quickly on that and what you've observed from the program?
Yes, I think I mentioned in my earlier remarks that initially we are just offering the training to life and business skills training to the women. That World Bank engaged the consultants to do a research, and the recommendation was that we include the reproductive health component to that training, so that as the beneficiaries are coming for these trainings, their spouses tag along, so that they come to also appreciate just what this intervention can bring to their households. This also was a result of many complaints that came through with regard to gender-based violence, because the women, most of their spouses were not familiar with the kind of intervention that was coming through and the kind of support that was coming to their household, and now they were going to benefit. When they received the money, the grant, we used to get reports of the spouses trying to use part of the money before they even engage in businesses. So now, what we are doing is, as we are conducting these trainings, we are inviting the spouses to join in the trainings so that they appreciate, and this has lessened the occurrences of gender-based violences in their households.
Thank you, Barnabas. Very interested in a topic that can, take a lot of time, and we hopefully can get deeper in the future event from the open house. I think it's the second one between now and December, or the third one. So let's proceed now with the intervention from the NGOs. We have Alison Huggins, Deputy Regional Director for Africa at Mercy Corps, and Winnie Auma, Vice President of Programs at Village Enterprise, and they will be talking today about dreams. Over to you.
Thank you, Lolly. Well, good evening and good morning from wherever you're joining us today. Thank you for being here. This is a topic we're so excited to share our learnings from the DREAMS project, and so excited that all of us are here. If you could move to the next slide, please. So we want to just start by talking about why dreams. So my role at Village Enterprise is really to support program adaptations and innovations, and I have been a critical part of getting dreams launched here in Uganda and supporting our Ethiopia team. And so when we started working in West Nile, I went down and met a 29-year-old young refugee woman called Anne. Anne is among those over 10 million refugees who are relying on humanitarian support to meet their basic needs. But we all know that aid organizations right now are contending with budget cuts. And this growing displaced population support is subject to change or even disappear without notice, given everything that is happening in our world. And yet this near-term, short support that the ants of this world are receiving is incredibly important, but it does not solve the long-term problems of protracted displacement. So we started thinking as Village Enterprise and Mercy, there has to be another solution, another way we can tackle, problems that are faced with refugees and problems that are being faced by this increasing pressure on the host communities. So as Village Enterprise, we bring a deep expertise in implementing poverty graduation model by helping households living in extreme poverty start their own micro businesses. Mercy Corps, on the other side, through the market systems development approach, drive systematic change in local economies. Our organizations have worked in the past in West Nile and parts of northern Uganda. And we thought that by naturally working in the same region, that Anne, for example, and there are many Annes in this context, would link with markets given that we worked in the same geography. But that was not the case. And so we started asking that, okay, we're increasing incomes, we're increasing consumption, we're increasing assets through our poverty graduation work. But how can we get Anne to be an active player in the market? On the massacre side, there was strong desire to be able to reach the most vulnerable, to reach Anne and make sure that she is an active market player. And so it's those conversations in between our field teams, in between our national teams, our regional and HQ that then gave birth to what we're calling Dreams today. So I want to pass it over to Alison to briefly talk about what Dreams is.
Great. So building on the experience that Mercy Corps and Village Enterprise had in our past programming, we realized that we needed a more deliberate way to link the poverty graduation participants who have benefited from small business support to become economically active and start small businesses, to proactively link them to markets, and the work that Mercy Corps has been doing in the same communities to help to grow market actors and support market actors to better reach poor households. And so the innovation that we came up with under Dreams is figuring out really how to layer, sequence, and integrate these two models together so that we're creating deliberate pathways and connection points between these two models to help support poor households like Anne's to be able to connect, to grow a small business, but then to connect to market actors so that she can access the goods and services and inputs that she needs to be able to effectively operate her business. But then she also has market linkages to aggregators and to other services that help her to be successful. So Dreams is a program that is starting with refugee populations in Ethiopia and in Kenya. We'll be working in Dolo Ado in Ethiopia and working in West Nile in Uganda, reaching 22,800 households and helping to support the establishment of 7,600 businesses. And over the course of this 4-year program, through this layered intervention, we seek to increase consumption, increase savings and assets, improve food security, and improve the perceived well-being of participant households. And so now Winnie will take us through a deeper discussion of how we figured out how to really layer and sequence these two models so that they can most effectively create this pathway out of poverty.
Thank you, Alison. So what you're seeing in this slide is a quick glance at our attempt to integrate these two proven models and build a joint customer journey for Anne. So both Village Enterprise and Mercy Corps independently have done their work, and there's evidence that we are both improving the well-being of the people that we have worked with. But we wanted to make sure that whoever is coming through delivering resilient enterprises and market systems is going through this customer journey and interacting with both graduation and market systems component in a very meaningful way. So as you can see from this graph, it's very sequenced in the nature it's being implemented. The first is we care first that we're reaching the Annas of this world. And so whether it's with host communities, whether it's within the refugee, context, we are making sure that we're reaching the Annas, and we have a very rigorous process to be able to go through that. And then Anne has to go through a sequence of activities. She will join a self-selected group of 3. She will then from that join as 10 people. From there, they will form a business savings group. And through that platform, they will be layering several activities, receiving trainings at different levels. And so the reason why we needed to create this new customer journey that Anne has to interact with is so that as two organizations coming together, we are being intentional in how Anne is interacting with the markets, how she is interacting with the graduation components of our program. And we believe that by combining these two models, we can really create viable pathways for business growth and poverty reduction. And so we're really excited about this. So if you could move to the next slide. So when you look at this customer journey, you can see the intentionality. Where you see a red and green, we are being intentional in those moments to come together as Mercy Corps and Village Enterprise to really think about, okay, what are the viable value chains that Anne can participate in? What does she need to be able to succeed in those within those value chains? What resources? So we've done market assessments, land assessment, we've done gender assessment, and we're being very intentional in how we are layering those. You can also see another area where we are coming together in a co-creation and co-design with private sector actors. The most important thing is that sometimes private sector actors lack the incentive to work with the vulnerable like Anne. And so in order to be able to create this incentive, Mercy Corps brings them on the table. With this particular program, there's a research component, and we needed the private sector actors to all be on board to understand the program so that Anne and the rest of the people that are part of the program can really meaningfully. This is not the complete customer journey of dreams. This is just a snippet peek into some of the activities or integration points that have happened. With that, I want to pass it over to Alison to talk more about the market systems and value chains that we'll be implementing.
So given the topic of today's session on making markets more inclusive, we wanted to spend a bit more time talking about the market systems development component of the program. So the objectives of the market systems component is really to work with private sector actors to help to strengthen the overall market ecosystem within the refugee camps and the host communities nearby, to really create that market pull that will drive economic growth within the camps. And so what that means is really working within these weak markets and thin markets to really create incentives to attract more private sector actors who are delivering services, who are aggregating production, and who are working with these poor households that have been supported through the graduation approach. So it's really a four-step process that we use. So first, we do in-depth market analysis to understand the constraints that private sector actors face in reaching these communities, but also to understand the constraints that poor households, including refugees, face in accessing markets. What we've seen is that often the private sector actors don't see the market opportunity that refugee communities represent, and don't really, they perceive it more as a humanitarian handout sort of population that's dependent on humanitarian assistance, rather than seeing refugees as really viable market actors. And so a lot of what we do is, as we co-create solutions with the private sector, is to help them understand the business potential that refugees and host communities represent, and also to develop viable business models for how they can affordably deliver services and reach these populations. So we undergo a lot of co-creation with the private sector to understand what constraints they face and how we can help to overcome those constraints through different mechanisms. And that could include training, it could include co-investment, it could include business consultancy support, so that they can really find solutions to help them overcome these challenges. The next step in our process is to co-invest so that we can share risks with the private sector, because at the end of the day, we know that the private sector is driven by profits. And so if they see it as too risky, or if they don't see the business potential within these communities, it's too risky of a venture for them to invest in. And so Mercy Corps' investment can help to buy down that risk by co-sharing the sort of costs of exploring expansion, of setting up agent networks, or other kind of investments that businesses may need to make to be able to reach these communities. And then finally, we work within these markets to develop the forward and backward linkages between market actors. So using really deliberate mechanisms, it may be incentives, it may be vouchers that we use. We link poor households to these market actors so that they can actually access the inputs or services that the market actors are providing. So I'll share two examples of how we're doing this. First of all is working within the sesame value chain in West Nile. So the key constraints that our teams identified with sesame producers were access to quality seeds and tools, knowledge of good production practices, aggregation, and value addition. And so what we've done is supported 2 private sector actors to access foundation seeds and start to undertake seed multiplication in areas very close to the camps. So that way we're working on the supply of quality seeds in a place that's accessible and nearby to the populations that we're ultimately trying to reach. We've strengthened local agri-input suppliers to sell seeds and tools, really by helping them understand the market potential that the camp communities, the refugees and the host communities represent, and helping to invest with them to overcome some of the costs of transportation and other constraints so that they could set up these agro-input dealers close to the camp communities. We're also working with Kiva to create an agricultural input loan product that's specific to refugees and helps to overcome some of the barriers that refugees face, including access to identification, documents, and others, so that they can access agricultural input loans. And then we are extending aggregator networks into these communities through secured purchasing agreements. Another example of how we're working on this in Doloado is on the goat value chain. And what's really interesting about working in these 2 different contexts is it gives us a chance to really compare experiences working in both a farming and agricultural value chain and in a livestock value chain. So the key constraints faced for goat producers were access to animal health services and veterinary inputs, access to financial services for business expansion. So we worked with agri-vet input dealers within the camps to help extend their presence and access by de-risking them to set up agent networks in areas very close to the camps to sell high quality agri-vet inputs. We linked our private veterinary pharmacies that we've created or helped to establish with community animal health workers to do outreach around good veterinary practices and to provide veterinary services. And we provided business training to those community animal health workers so that they could develop their own business models for their service provision. And then we also worked with a partner MFI with the Somali Microfinance Institute, as well as Raise Microfinance, to help them to extend their presence within the camps and to develop Sharia compliant loan products that were appropriate to the populations that we were working with. And then we also helped them to create a digital loan product so that we could expand access to those services. So intentionally, as we were doing these partnerships, building these partnerships with the private sector, we really kept that end market or that end customer in mind, who is the refugee or the host community population. And we're really helping the private sector to design solutions that would ultimately be appropriate and be able to reach those end users. Next slide, please.
Alison,
Thank you.
Wrapping up.
Thank you. And I'll jump in here with some lessons learned. I think one of the biggest things that we have learned in this process is that as you're working with multiple stakeholders, so we're working with Mercy Corps, we have an evaluation partner, we have private sector actors, we have refugees and host communities, that it's really important to have a shared vision. It's important to have collaborations at multiple or across multiple levels in the organization and within the project itself. So we have several touch points across the consortium. Our field teams are meeting, we're meeting as national teams. We have regional teams who have presented the project to the community as a joint project. We're also working together to really co-design and continue to do ongoing adaptations. We're working together with private sector actors. And you can see from the customer journey, we're being very intentional in terms of how Anne and the rest of her colleagues are interacting with the DREAMS project. And I think overall, if we do this, our goal is that we can then experience exponential results from the DREAMS project. Next slide, please. In terms of some of the challenges that we are facing here, this is a new concept. So graduation staff are learning MSc, MSc staff are learning graduation, and our organizations are also learning how to work together, how to present this to the community together. So it's constant learning, it's constant communication, it's constant adaptation. The other learning we learned is that market systems development requires longer lead in time. So for example, in Uganda, our cohort 1 groups have not yet received support from private sector actors because we needed to do the market assessment. We needed to be able to understand the constraints within the different value chains and then identify stakeholders who can then support these value chains and then work together to onboard those private sector actors that can support with this work. And so that took a longer time. And so we're taking all of this learning as we replicate, as we think about scaling dreams to other areas to make sure that we're building in longer time for co-designing interventions before we can jump into implementation. We have a randomized control trial study as a component of this project. That means that dreams has to be, implemented in a very controlled way so that we can avoid spillover, so that we can learn and be able to really build evidence that these 2 proven models can work. And our cities come with their own complexities, How much of this information do you need to give out? So for example, we had to develop communication principles and decide what information, how much information do we provide to different stakeholders. And so we continue to work with this. And the beauty is that because we have a shared vision, we can be candid with each other. We are flexible and we're just excited to learn together and really make this a meaningful experience for the ends of this world. I will pass it to you, Alison.
Sure, and just to conclude, based on the experience that we've had in developing dreams for the refugee context, we've really built a strong partnership between our 2 organizations and an evidence-based approach especially through the 2 RCTs that we have ongoing. And so we have a vision as our 2 organizations to scale this integrated and sequenced model to address other key issues and to reach other priority populations with the DREAMS model. So beyond the refugee context where we're currently working, we have a vision to expand our role to reach IDPs in Northeast Nigeria and to work with refugees in Kenya. We also see this as a potential tool for women's economic empowerment, and both organizations take a really strong gender approach to our work. And so we want to continue to build this tool as a way to deliberately work with women and promote women's economic empowerment. We see relevance to working with young people, especially given the unemployment challenges across Africa, and look forward to being able to adapt this model to reach young people deliberately to create work opportunities. Both of our organizations target and work with the ultra poor, and so we're looking to scale this model to work with ultra poor communities in Kenya and Uganda. And then finally, we see a lot of need and a lot of potential to adapt this model to the challenges of climate change. So we'll continue to design for climate change adaptation with a focus on climate smart agricultural approaches and financial services to strengthen climate resilience. Thanks so much. We appreciate being able to share.
Thank you so much, Alison and Winnie. There's been quite a few questions or suggestions or requests in the chat for examples of graduation programs or economic inclusion programs in the context of forced displacement. And Ines has shared with everyone the link to our Partnership for Economic Inclusion website, where you can find other examples of graduation programs in these contexts. A very quick question for Alison and Winnie. If you can please share your quick reflections on how NGO interventions can contribute to create country capacity and complement government policies and programs without creating parallel systems, or by eventually integrating these systems into government interventions, both at the local level and at the central level, which might make it more sustainable over time.
I can go first and then Austin, I'll pass it over to you. Well, thank you so much. So we've already started working with governments in Kenya. We're already working with the government of Kenya to implement a project in northern parts of Kenya. And so we're supporting build the capacity of government officials with the hope that graduation can become their flagship project for social protection. We've worked with county governments in West Pokot to help them engender their climate smart policy. So there's already ongoing work. And so we hope to be able to continue to work with different governments as we learn and document the successes and approaches that are working across our programming.
And I can just add that the market systems development approach really looks to work with private sector and help to incentivize them to expand and grow. But we really rely on that enabling environment that, that government creates to create a strong sort of supportive structure for the private sector to thrive. I think also, given that a lot of our work is in for example, the agriculture sector, there's a really important role for the public sector and for government services around extension services and other types of support to the agriculture sector. And we certainly want to partner with those public institutions to be able to strengthen their outreach and their capacity. And so we don't necessarily, as market systems actors, we look to be as facilitative as possible and not to play a role directly in the market system, but instead to look for different actors that have a key role to play within market systems and help them to do that better. And so it's really about creating linkages between private sector, between public sector, and between the communities that we look to serve in a way that Mercy Corps ourselves doesn't become a part of that system.
Thank you so much. So we are eating up a little bit into the questions and answers session, but I would like to pass the mic now to our discussant. Melissa, you have 6 minutes so that we can really give a little bit of time to the panelists to address some of the questions that are being posed in the chat. Over to you, Melissa.
Thank you. So I've been asked to, share some reflections on the report and country experiences, talk about USAID's experience, and then talk about working with the government and moving forward. So I'd say, reflecting on the report and the cases that we heard, a really good example of two different overall approaches, very context-based. And this work being context-driven and locally owned is just, it's imperative, it's foundational. So we're looking in the Zambia report very much about agriculture development, market development, more of a, traditional linkages and producer aggregation. And then in Ethiopia, having a hybrid approach that integrates what we might call push and a pull, strengthening the market, bring in market actors to pull folks into the market, but also building capacity from the ground up, including, entrepreneurs, producers, and merging approaches that is a bit more direct support, such as the entrepreneur training, that youth training, and then that market systems development and engaging local actors, and again, depending on the needs and the context. In Zambia, we saw in the Zambia report some, many examples of, say, leveraging and strengthening local capacity. For example, working with savings groups and leveraging those groups as actors. So again, different overall approaches depending on the context, but very much, common themes across both of these country contexts. Again, both took a very market-based approach, which is quite important. This is, again, another essential component of economic inclusion work to ensure that there is a viable market that is accessible and profitable. So we saw the activities did comprehensive analyses of the end market demand, whether that's entrepreneurial services or different commodities and the quality parameters just determined, demanded, and then looking at what are the gaps in supply. So then the activity is strategically focusing on addressing those supply gaps that help, close the gap in that market opportunity. We saw scaling the role of existing market structures in both. For example, we're using savings or producer groups to disseminate information, aggregate product, facilitate lower cost input purchasing through economies of scale, and then embedding services, whether that's value chain financing or extension into current input distribution or output purchasing models. And of course, in these, it's critical to ensure that local actors are driving the scaling, that we're not telling a savings group or a co-op that they should start sharing all this information. They should start talking about nutrition and providing inputs. Maybe that's beyond them, or maybe it takes some steps. So again, that the local actors really need to be part of those decisions and determine how they would like to expand their models. Diversification we saw in both models, again, whether that's commodities or entrepreneurial opportunities, as well as market linkages, and then in some cases market functions, so filling those market gaps with with entrepreneurs. Critical for resilience, broader inclusion, and also enabling participants to choose. That's critical for local ownership, sustainability, and also particularly positive youth development. We know about youth development that youth really need to have that self-determination. They need to be able to choose their path and to feel empowered. These activities very much, the activities that were shared very much match our experiences at USAID. Again, as the cases and framing indicate, and as I said before, approaches must be context-based, thinking about the potential target sectors, public and private partners, and the approaches that we use must be locally driven. So from the start, even from when we as donors, when we are designing a solicitation, we need to be consulting stakeholders and diverse local stakeholders to determine what should the activity objectives be, what might be the potential partners, and then through the activity work planning and evaluation to ensure that there is inclusive participation. At USAID, we say nothing about them without them. So it's very much ensuring that stakeholders are really co-creating and co-informing. USAID very much uses the market systems and market-based approaches that we saw in Zambia and that were really highlighted in Ethiopia. Again, engaging both public and private actors, facilitating implementation at a level that's appropriate, for the context, while strengthening local capacity and enabling actors to fill market gaps. So again, we're starting from where we are, in this market systems approach. So that, again, the degree to which programming supports market actors is very much context-based. In thin or conflict markets, refugee context, maybe there's a little more support, there's a little more direct. And then we just want to make sure that we've got some kind of, exit strategy, sustainability strategy, so that we're ensuring that we're building the capacity and that we're connecting the resources, very much including finance, business development, so that local actors can take these on. Adaptive management and learning are really critical in all of these contexts. So we often use a pilot scale, probe and refine approach, testing multiple approaches and partnerships, reflecting through the process, and ensuring that we are including our partners, and regularly having kind of learning check-ins and seeing how do we adapt our approach moving forward. Great point that Mercy Corps made that I would resound is don't leave out government in MSD, market systems development. We tend to talk mostly about private sector actors, but again, governments are taking a lot of tax revenues. They do fund extension, which is typically, woefully, under capacity in terms of the number of people, and enabling environment. If policies can constrain or deter investment, they can constrain or affect inclusion. So very much it's again engaging with the sector to determine what are some of those policy changes needed. And I think that, and the last thing is, again, business case is essential. Sometimes public and private sector actors may not understand just the simple business case for inclusion. as a woman in 2022, I'm kind of tired of talking about the business case for why women should be included and get paid. And the same thing, I mean, and any, minority or disadvantaged group, we all need, don't we know we all need to be here and we all have value, but everyone doesn't realize that. Or sometimes businesses don't know who their customers are. They're sitting in a capital city and they don't understand that. What, you mean like 60% of farmers are women? Or wow, this ethnic minority is really involved in the supply chain. I had no idea, because I'm sitting here in Portland, Oregon as a coffee buyer, and I have really no idea about the ethnic dynamics in Burma. So helping them understand their customers, their suppliers, and the business case for inclusion can really unlock a lot of motivation. So in terms of government partnerships, again, the way forward, we see that market systems approaches, market-based approaches are increasingly used in donor-funded activities, from the humanitarian to the development sector. We see that donors, governments are increasingly wanting to link the humanitarian and the assistance activity. So there is that kind of seamless push-pull. There's that efficiency, very much, wanting to ensure that we understand that the broader donor landscape and there's coordination across activities. I'm interested to hear from our two panelists about how did they integrate their work into the broader donor landscape, which sometimes can enable or hinder market systems development, but there's efficiencies that we can realize. Essential to make funds go farther and ensure local ownership and sustainability. So again, local ownership is very important for USAID, increasingly important for all donors. And just remembering that there are multiple entry points, especially when we're talking about market systems or private sector engagement. I think there's, really nice example of that in both of our cases.
Thank you very much, Melissa. A lot of very important points. I can just highlight too the high percentage of women farmers, the fact that women are better at repaying debt, and yet they still have to pay higher interest rates for accessing credit. The role of the government at different levels, at both the central and the local level, given the fact that their policies can have an important impact in the enabling environment and in even providing the incentives, such as tax incentives, to make these programs more successful. So lots of very interesting comments. A very quick question to you. As part of your work with USAID, you have engaged with many countries to conduct value chains and market analysis. Do you have some good examples and some quick reactions on risk-sharing approaches and instruments that have been successfully used to transfer risks to markets?
Yeah, so I'd say, there are a few, again, depending on the context. So, certainly value chain financing is one where, again, you have, a bank may be lending to an input supplier or larger buyer, and then they are extending loans to farmers, so that, typically the buyer, the input supplier, they're larger, so they can get a larger loan at a lower interest rate, and then they are able to serve farmers, more efficiently. Things, and sometimes there are tripartite credit agreements where a bank is, more formally involved. Sometimes activities will use cost share grants. So that is, again, having the market actor take a bit more, to the buyer, the input supplier, take some of the risk. But if they're doing something, completely new, they're working in a new area, working on a new technology, working with a new community, sometimes there is some cost share that you need there. I say, again, strengthening the market actor's capacity, not financial, but just, strengthening that capacity. And then sharing expertise, again, one of the ways to sort of reduce risk, and not necessarily, transfer it to the market, but reduce perceived risk and make the market actors more willing to engage, is just to share expertise and know-how about working in the context, addressing some of the enabling environment issues that, again, more of a risk reduction, and then drive, pulling in more external investments. So then, making that risk, again, like if there are multinationals that are sourcing, for example, you know, then trying to bring in some external finance, so that way you're you're broadening the, you're distributing the risk more broadly around a bigger market. So again, it's not just a localized, because again, often these inclusion or market systems, market development, value chain development, do ask a lot of smallholders, particularly when we're looking at they have to upgrade, upgrade to meet market standards. They have to meet sustainability standards, and how much of a premium is there? So it's, certainly ensuring that there is an end market demand is one way to, again, put that risk in the market, but linking the producers proactively to the buyers and having a commitment before you're doing all that upgrading and investment. So then the risk is shared across the producer and the buyer who is investing in that upgrading.
Thank you so much, Melissa. So let's move now to the questions and answers. There's been a lot of questions in the chat, so I hope I can make justice to some of them. And let me start with the question that is, I guess, in a way related to the last one that you answered about the transferring risk to markets or risk sharing approaches. We have all seen, in the context of the Ukraine war, and as a result of many other drivers, is a significant increase in food, fuel, and fertilizers. And these are having an impact in the design of these programs. So has there been any adjustment to these programs or to these type of programs as a result of these food, fuel, and fertilizers? And if it hasn't, should there be any adjustment to be able to address these issues, given their impact on poverty? I don't know who would like to start. Melissa, you've already talked about risk sharing approaches. Is there anything else that we could do to address some of these topics? Boban, do you want to start? Anybody else? I'm asking Boban because he is from the World Bank, so I feel a little bit more comfortable putting him on the spot.
Thanks a lot, Lolly. Yeah, I mean, I honestly, I don't think I know I have a good answer for this, but I think with the kind of recent increases in prices, I mean, it would be kind of, I think it's important to think. I mean, I think at the bank we kind of think about this quite a bit, right? Thinking about safety nets to first kind of stabilize consumption, because when you kind of start thinking about market linkages before you've gotten consumption and you've covered those bases, it becomes a much tougher job to kind of get into having these conversations about how do you link the extreme poor households to markets, because there has been an erosion in the real value of a lot of the benefits that they have been getting from this, right? So I would say, like, kind of thinking about it from the safety nets perspective, and then kind of looking at it from a market linkages perspective, maybe the way to go. But I think we have others who kind of implement these programs on the ground, and they may actually have more insights as well on this.
Thank you very much, Boban. Anybody else wants to try to address that question? No takers. So I guess I think Colin was the one that asked the question. We can try to set up another event to actually discuss that topic. Another set of questions were related to the adaptation of these type of programs to urban settings. As you all know, in the impact of COVID was much stronger for the urban sector, and particularly for the urban informal sector. So when you are thinking about developing these type of programs in those settings, what are the things that are still relevant? from these interventions, and what are the things that are perhaps a little bit different?
Sorry, Lolly, I'm not able to hear. There's maybe others can, but I just cannot hear.
Can everyone else hear me? Yeah. So Alison, are you going to take that that question? Anybody else that wants to take it?
I guess I can start. I mean, market systems development, we really look to understand what are the primary and most promising market sectors that we can work in within a given context. And so in rural communities, it's largely agricultural or livestock interventions, but in urban geographies, it might be very different economic opportunities. So it might be a lot of support to small and micro enterprises. It may be looking at formal labor markets and how can we facilitate greater participation in those formal labor markets. So I think the key is really to understand what are those key sectors that offer a lot of opportunity for poor households to have greater participation and benefit from those markets. And then, do these steps of market assessments and then identifying constraints and identifying partnerships to work with private sector in order to help support access to those opportunities. So I do think it would look largely different depending on the sector, but I think that the key first step is to do that market analysis to understand which sectors you should be working in.
Thank you very much. And can the DREAMS approach be helpful in those settings as well?
I think it's really relevant. And I do think that, just really creating this push-pull dynamic between graduation and market systems development, we feel that it can work anywhere in any geography. I think, I think that we haven't tested it in urban areas. And so I think we'd have to make a lot of adaptations to the program model itself, but I think that it can be a relevant intervention.
Thank you, Alison. There was, I don't know if you can hear me now, Boban, but there were quite a few questions about the incentives for buyers to work with such micro producers, and you had included an answer in the chat, but you might want to perhaps elaborate a little bit on that.
Mm-hmm. Sounds good, Lolly. I can hear you now. No, what I was basically, I think the question was, what are the incentives of big private sector operators to kind of engage with small farmers, right? I think it's important to kind of think about, what is the value proposition that the small farmers bring, which you don't get otherwise, right, from other kind of sources. But also it's also important to kind of think about who are these private sector players you're talking about, right? These are not necessarily the big Nestle's of the world. It could just be a local trader in the in the nearby community. So in the case of ZATP and SWL, the kind of incentives that kind of came about, the reason we kind of started exploring this synergy was basically because when as ZATP was implementing the project, they needed some, they were not able to get a sufficient number of farmers who met their minimum kind of, minimum requirements. And so they wanted to kind of scan, other databases, other programs in the region that was working with other farmers who could potentially, either, upgrade into these bigger farmers, or could even kind of supply to these existing farmers, because that was another issue that they found, was that even though there were contracts that their beneficiaries had with buyers, they were not always able to meet the supply needs of the buyers. And so, are there other actors in that area that could produce what you're producing, and then you buy from them, you kind of, sort it out, do some kind of processing, and then you sell it forward, right? So that was kind of the motivation with which we were even exploring this. So it's important to identify what these values are, and what value proposition these beneficiaries bring, but also what is it, what is in it for the buyers, right? And how do you kind of, what issues are they facing, and then how does this set of beneficiaries kind of solve that problem? So I think it's important to think about that when we think about incentives there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we are reaching the end of the event. Unfortunately, we run a little bit out of time and we don't have time to address all the questions. My sense is that each presentation deserved a whole session to be able to go in depth into all the details. And I think there's been lots of important and interesting questions on scaling up these programs, making them sustainable over time, and not just financially sustainable, but also technically sustainable, and creating capacity at the country level to have them running after, for example, NGOs or the World Bank leave. Some of these questions will be the focus of future events. We talked a little bit about gender, social norms. Barnabas shared with us how they had to adjust the program a little bit to include spouses, so that in a way trying to address the negative consequences of empowering women. We will have sessions on climate change and transition to the green economy. There was already an event on economic inclusion programs in urban settings. I think those events were recorded and hopefully are available on the PEI, the Partnership for Economic Inclusion website. And we very much look forward to continuing the conversation. But before I close the session, I would like to ask you to please take a moment to respond to the Zoom poll that just showed up on your screen. I've been told that I have to read the questions so that the translators can translate it. The question is, would you use ideas and materials from this session for your future work in this area? And the answers include strongly agree, 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 not disagree, disagree, strongly disagree. Please go ahead and answer. From what I see is that most of the participants are selecting strongly agree and agree. There are a few neutral ones. And maybe the next question is, we move to the next question. Would you recommend this series of webinars to your colleagues? And this is a single choice with strongly agree, agree, neither agree nor disagree, disagree, and strongly disagree. And again, we see that the majority of the respondents are strongly agree and agree, with one person neutral. All right, well, thank you so much to everyone, and particularly thank you very much to all the presenters and our discussant. We look forward to seeing many of you at our future event and to continue the conversations and get deeper into some of the issues and questions that we were not able to respond today. Have a nice day, everyone, or evening or afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. Bye.